Hello, this YouTube video is going to be about the concepts and topics that we talked about this week. I'm going to start making new YouTube videos that are going to basically be the week in review YouTube videos that you can watch on your own time. I suggest watching them as soon as they come out, so that way you're not cramming before a unit exam or before a semester exam, and then of course before the AP exam. You really want to get these concepts down as soon as you can get these concepts down. And these YouTube videos are designed to help you. I will say about this YouTube video, I know a lot of you were also still very confused about the assignment that I gave you at the end of Friday's class about writing a thesis statement and then filling out the essay outline. So I gave you all until Saturday morning. I said I would check Saturday morning. I did get a couple of messages in my email inbox saying that they were still confused. So I'm going to take this time to explain the assignment again at the end of this YouTube video. And I'll check Monday morning for the assignment. I will say though, however, if you're confused because you weren't paying attention during class or you weren't listening during Thursday's class, which you kind of needed to understand what we were going over on Friday, then you need to pay attention throughout the whole YouTube video to really kind of get the concepts that you need to then perform well on the assignment. So yes. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Yep, okay. So the unit that we covered, the unit that we're covering, I'm sorry, is Unit 1, Ideals of a Democracy. And the social problem that we are going to try to solve, or you guys are going to come up with solutions to that social problem by the end of this unit, is police brutality. So we're going to be talking about policing and police violence throughout this unit. It is a very hard topic. I know a lot of us are very passionate about this topic, but let me reiterate here, please, 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 make sure that we are not attacking other people for their views that they present in class. And also, please, please, please start getting better at coming to class, not just with opinions, but with evidence to support those opinions by reading newspapers, articles, etc. Okay, so we started off last week on Monday. We went over some vocabulary. We talked about the difference between a state, a government, and a regime, and legitimacy, so some key vocabulary that we're going to be using throughout this unit. We said a state, not like Texas or California or Indiana, but a state, the political science term, refers to a political organization that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in a territory, right? And so I gave you all the example of me murdering my brother's murderer. That would not be, I would be prosecuted for that. I would be prosecuted for murder because I don't have in our society a right to use violence here, right? Only the San Benito PD has that. Well, the San Benito PD has that monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. We said that a government is what runs the state. We also said that states can do other things than just have that monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, but that's something that really, really makes the state unique. And then we said a regime refers to the type of government that basically runs a state. So in the United States, it could be a constitutional republic. In China, it could be a authoritarian regime. You can get more specific with your definitions. You can say a totalitarian autocracy runs North Korea. And then we talked about this idea of legitimacy that is going to also be a very prominent term throughout this unit. And we said that it refers to a belief that a rule, institution, or leader has the right to govern. And we said when legitimacy goes away, you should expect chaos, etc. These other two terms that I introduced as well were militarization of the police and over-policing versus under-policing. Militarization of the police like Harry. We're going to talk about the reasons for this and what are the basic two drivers of militarization of the police in American society, more this both the fact that police started confronting people with more high-powered weapons on the streets, and also leftover military equipment from America finding its way into police departments in the United States. And so this is an example of that in the top right-hand corner of the San Benito Police Department owning people. And then over-policing versus under-policing, we talked about within the context of social contract, which is going to be what I'm going to talk about next. In class, I defined state again, and then I asked you guys to imagine what would be problematic about a society where Mr. Diaz is able to kill his brother. I looked at all the Pear Deck answers, and you all said, well, there would be a lot of gray area about, who can or when violence is acceptable. So if we didn't have a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, we went back into time. We talked about feudal societies and talked about the nightmares of AP World History and how hard AP World. I'm going to leave that alone for you right now. We talked about vigilantes. Also, we said in a world where a state doesn't have the you can expect, a lot of extrajudicial killing, maybe a lot of vigilantes like Batman, but maybe people aren't as benign or kind as Batman. And then we started asking this question, and I really told you guys, and I showed you guys a list of examples of states/governments, and then we are different everywhere around the world. They really are. Some are seen as oppressive. Some are not very good at their job. They're very weak states. We talked about drug violence in Mexico. We also talked about the Syrian state, etc. And I asked you guys the question viewed as oppressive. You all provided a lot of great answers. You said you should expect protests, chaos, even the government, or in democracies, you should expect the people wanting all kinds of things, civil disobedience, and at the extreme end right here, even rebellion. So here's a Syrian rebel soldier, and of course, the American Revolution. Era, a unique time period where new ideas on how government should be organized and run challenged conventional wisdom. They lived in the Enlightenment. We talked about this idea for governments in Europe especially, but also in other societies. One of you mentioned the mandate of heaven. In China, they legitimized themselves, the king's right to rule. God had given them the right to rule. And then we said during the Enlightenment period, Thomas Hobbes tries to answer this question again: where do governments get their right to rule over us? Where does and he kind of says, or he says that divine right stuff, that's BS. They got the right to rule over us through a social contract. He claims that a long time ago, people were short, just like you said, or you guys articulated in your Pear Deck responses when Mr. Diaz, in a world where Mr. Diaz would be able to kill kind of chaos Hobbes said existed, and then people decided to enter into a contract with their government. Yeah. And so although Thomas Hobbes was a monarchist, meaning he was as the power of this idea and what this idea could imply. And so here's the implications of his idea. John Locke kind of takes it to a more extreme extent, but a king or government's power too, suddenly the government doesn't get its authority from God, and they're supposed to protect people's rights. This implies that the people have the right to replace or overthrow it. Power. I know this is pretty, like, for us living in the 21st century with 21st century values, we're like, yeah, duh, of course, obvious, but not so obvious. It's the government, that was pretty normal. Too bad. So yeah, this is a really revolutionary idea, and we say the Declaration of Independence was very much this document that said, you broke the contract, King George. Here are the ways you broke the contract. We show that America's property, made claims that the state was very abusive, and in some ways it was. This, however, we talked and untangled this a bit, was a piece of related to the Boston Massacre, but we're not going to get into that right now. There's me. I don't know why I put that picture there. I just wanted to show off at the British Embassy with a camera. And then here is George Washington crossing the Delaware and the famous painting as well. So we said the Declaration of Independence is very much, you broke the contract, King George. Kimberly Jones, who is a Black Lives Matter activist, talks about the social contract pretty intelligently. She talks about all kinds of abuses that she kind of white people, I guess, or all instances of white people terrorizing history, harming and committing violences against Black people in American history. That they broke the contract. For 400 years, they've been breaking the contract. And so we untangled this a bit, and then we said, we kind of compared the protesters that we've seen on television to, and social media, most likely most of you saw on social media, to American revolutionaries. We talked about this idea of we kind of came up with a lot of mixed responses about the legitimacy of Black Lives Matter protesters, etc. And so things that she was talking about in her video were instances like Tulsa, where a white mob descends upon Black Wall Street, people there. We talked about instances where civil rights activists and protesters were being killed, or the police, and the importance of understanding that context for our current debate about policing and race in the United States that exists. We talked about the existing and how that can be seen as a broken social contract as well, a broken social contract as well. And then, of course, we talked about killing, of course, George Floyd this summer. That was the one of the catalysts for a whole range of demonstrations throughout the United States. Here, I also introduce what's a preview of what's to come. We're going to read this article when we get into the unit 4, which will be on political ideologies, about the going to watch the new documentary on ICE on Netflix, and we're also going to read this Pulitzer Prize-winning piece from ProPublica called "The Disappeared." You can also read it in Spanish if that's something that you want to do. It's this really good article about immigrant teens that go missing, and it's kind of illustrative of the fact that in the over policing, I guess. We also saw extrajudicial violence, meaning violence that was not legal. In the case of George Floyd, or Dever. We saw over policing in the context of police officers being very active about policing Black people, especially in that image of the dog biting the civil. And it can be very irritating and oftentimes can break trust between communities of color. Recent examples would be like Eric Gardner being arrested in New York City for selling loose cigarettes. So he was accused of selling loose cigarettes in New York City, and a New York City police officer, and ended up dying. So that would be an example of over policing, because it's kind of like these little infractions, and it can be seen by the community as like harassment and etc. That could be an example of a broken social contract, maybe. We talked about that a little bit, but under policing can also be an example of a broken social contract. And so what we mean, the police not maybe having enough resources, or the police not putting enough prioritization in policing violent crimes or helping solve. In this case, in this piece's case, the missing child of an immigrant mother, because they had all kinds of probably list him as a child that was missing. They listed him as a child that had run away, and so a lot of missed opportunities there, etc. And so we were policing and under policing. We said sometimes there can be both. So sometimes in communities of color, you can expect the police to police a lot of little. This theory that I'll introduce later on, that's called broken windows theory. So people that commit small infractions get cited. Police going after big problems like murderers, burglaries, etc., are not being effective at doing or catching them. Shootings. So more on this. If I confuse you a bit on this, I'm sorry, but I'm going to move forward. So this article is really good. Here's an excerpt. It kind of gets at this idea of a broken social contract. It kind of gives very much political science definition of the terms, is feeling Black people. So go ahead and take time to read through this excerpt. Tell me what you think about it in the comments if you want. So then we talked about like social contract is one of the main democratic ideals embedded within U.S. founding documents. We said from the social contract, all these other kind of ideals spring up, like popular sovereignty, natural rights, etc. Ideals, U.S. we identified, we talked about natural rights, this idea that there are God-given rights. We are going to talk about rights when we get to the Bill of Rights. This rights is very much idea, this idea that people have the right to life, liberty, and property. But then Thomas Jefferson, of course, changed it a bit in the Declaration of Independence. or men have right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so it's this idea that there are God-given rights that can't be taken away from anybody. The U.S. foundational documents, or the excerpts from U.S. foundational documents that I introduced, it's this idea that government is created by and subject to the will of the people, and then, of course, social contract. Ideals highlighted. Now, at the same time this week, I also assigned you a podcast from the 1619 Project with a couple of turned it in, and so many of you seem to enjoy the podcast. A lot of you wrote a lot for that response to question number 6, and I really, really just want to give you a shout out. And so it kind of begs the question, in the 1619 podcast assignment, at least for the first couple of weeks, I'm not going to have late penalties. It really gets at this idea that the ideal Declaration of Independence and the Constitution weren't lived up to. And then Hannah Nicole Jones presents this interesting argument that says that Black people helped the United States with, of course, all kinds of protests, attempts to, claim these rights. And she does note to help with the expansion of Black rights in throughout American history. So it was a pretty interesting. I think a lot of you as well. I think or I just want to say that I think the strong part of that podcast really was when it starts talking about the civil rights movement. Be a whole unit, right? That's going to be Unit 3 that we are going to talk about within the context of mass incarceration. So keep tuned for that. It's being highlighted here. This is an excerpt of the Declaration of Independence. Remember, the Declaration of Independence is very much this document that said King George III, you broke the contract. Here you can see popular sovereignty being highlighted. Definitive correct answer to this. You could have highlighted a little bit more, a little bit less. There would have been. Then here's the preamble to the United States Constitution. We introduce the preamble to the U.S. Constitution because it is one of the foundational documents we're going to be wrestling with. In between the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution was this major document called the Article, which we'll be talking about later when we get to the debates about the ratification of the United States Constitution. And so this was your exit ticket. You didn't actually have time to complete the exit ticket. That or I talked about the tear gassing of protesters in Lafayette Square across the White House. And we are definitely going to be talking about that in Unit 2 when we get to the here's some just great resources. This is a really cool. I would definitely click on this. Ferguson, Missouri. And this is a really, really cool article, The Spy Who Came Home. I was planning on assigning it this year, but I decided against including it. And I'm so sorry that I couldn't include this piece, but I couldn't. Like, it just didn't make sense to include. But it's very good. It's about the CIA that decides to work as a police officer in the United States in Georgia after feeling disillusioned with the CIA's success or lack of success here, comes and decides to become a police officer in Georgia, and he sounds like a really good police officer. And he talks about all kinds of yeah, he kind of highlights some of the problems in police training and stuff like that. It's a really good article. Here's just a couple of fast facts. We didn't get to talk about this, but this is yeah. Then we got into types of democracy. We said that the United States is a representative democracy, representatives to handle legislation and rule the country on their behalf. We talked about republicanism. These are just basic definitions. We're not talking about the Republican Party. And then we said participatory, pluralist, and elite democracy. And we said America, ever complex, is like a combination of all three. So you should think of elite as like the smallest number of people, I guess the smallest number of people running the country or making important decisions for a democracy. So it emphasis on highly educated, wealthy individuals. Is more like competing groups, competing factions, fight for policymaking or fight for peace. There's a lot of complexity and fighting in the system, but it produces like compromise and legislation gets done that way. Participatory people participating no matter their socioeconomic status. And so we discussed, again, participatory emphasizes broad participation in politics and civil society, but people have very some elements we can identify a participatory democracy include like referendums on marijuana legalization that we saw in Colorado and Washington state. So everyone vote to make this decision whether they think marijuana is legal, should be legal or not, right? As opposed to lawmakers themselves making that decision. So referendums in our democracy. We also said that we saw an example of participatory democracy in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and how she really kind of galvanized a lot of support against this this well-funded Democratic congressman for several years, really was a nobody, bartender from New York, and manages to upset. We said a pluralist democracy implies organized group-based activism by people with common interests and all striving for the same political goals. We used the National Rifle Association and March for Our Lives as may have a participatory democracy because it very much started as a grassroots movement. As it becomes more organized, it kind of has elements of a pluralist democracy. Remember, this is really like a scale. Then we said an elite democracy discourages participation by the majority of citizens and cede power to the educated and or wealthy. We said that the founding fathers kind of an elite democracy because there was no women, people of other different types of races, etc., present in the signing of the Declaration or in the creating of disorganized constitution, etc. So more examples of participatory democracy. This is when I was your age, so Occupy Wall Street protesters and in the Obama years, early Obama years. Pluralist democracy, we talked about police union, or we talked about teacher unions, and then we also talked about the National Rifle Association, all kinds of interest groups that can exist. Grassroots groups are more emblematic of participatory democracy. We said although there is a Black Lives Matter they like organization to them, and they probably are more emblematic of participatory democracy. Theme of police violence, we talked about police unions as being a group. We said that this is their political power over a pluralist democracy, because they're an organized group that often fights for their own policy interests through stuff like strikes, and so watch on the power of police unions, etc. And then elite democracy, we talked about how Harvard Law has produced a lot of presidents and produced a lot of people. We went through examples, we did a little bit of a Pear Deck, and continued. And then we talked about the Articles of Confederation as being this in-between document between the Declaration of Independence, the first government of the United States was written under the Articles of Confederation. We said that it was very weak. 13 all states must agree to amend the Articles of Confederation. Washington did not become president right after the Revolutionary War. He didn't become president until the Constitution was finally ratified later on in 1787. People, no right to raise or maintain a standing army, and no national court system, no national currency. So several of the things that we take for granted now did not exist in this. Predictably, there was a lot of power that was placed and vested within individual states, in the sense of like New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts. They had a lot of power, but there wasn't a lot of power within the federal government or the national. Related to Black Lives Matter protesters as people that some of you had a lot of sympathies for, and then we talked about how Constitutional Convention as a bunch of elite rich people basically installing a stronger government to ensure that the poor people aren't able to greater equality or access to or yeah, I guess more equality, because a lot of you really we did say that was kind of like a fringe historian view, that the more prominent historian view was that convention, they only wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation. They were pragmatic. They were practical people. They just wanted a government that wasn't going to tolerate this violence. They wanted a stronger state. They wanted a stronger state, one that had a stronger monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, and one that was more successful at making sure that the social contract. There was a constitutional convention. We'll read the Constitution this upcoming week. The delegates agreed, however, the main essence of what they agreed necessary but fearful of crises of power. So the draft of the Constitution submitted to states for ratification. There was a draft of the Constitution submitted to states for ratification, and then we talked Constitution and anti-federalists who oppose the creation of a stronger national government, arguing the Constitution would threaten citizens' personal liberties and effectively make the president a king. Expanding executive power in modern politics, and we're actually going to do a couple of case studies this week, so just stay tuned for that. Number one, we read Brutus number one, or you should have read Brutus number one. If you didn't, I'm very upset with you because it's very good. But we talked about how Brutus was his real name. David Yates is the one who actually wrote Brutus number one. He published it. He was an anti-federalist, meaning he didn't want greater power in the federal government and the national government because he thought it could lead to being abusive government. And then I introduced, of course, Gretchen from Mean Girls. She, in this scene, she heavily identifies with Brutus, who's one of the senators after he tries to consolidate power, because in this scene they're reading Julius Caesar, the book written by Shakespeare. Episode. And she says we should totally just stab Caesar. So I just thought that was really cute to include. So in Brutus number one, the anonymous author posed a series of questions about and critiques of the then proposed constitution. The national government had too much power, a standing army could diminish liberty, and that representatives would not truly represent the people. And so the main idea behind representatives not truly representing the people would be like, if it's too big of a the 13 colonies were only 3 million people, and now we live in a republic of 330 million. He said, if it's too big of a republic, how can you possibly expect someone to get their voice to be enacted into law? Like, that's not fair. That's not democratic at all. And so Brutus was very much in favor of a participatory democracy. Political power should reside more with local governments, such as states, not the political science definition of the term states, but they should have more decision-making authority to the people. And so a lot of us like this argument. A lot of us really like this argument. And a lot of us especially like this argument when we saw what was happening in Portland, right? So we talked to be important to quell protesters and vandalism, and a lot of us really, really did not like what we saw. A lot of us did not like what we saw in Portland, and we're very much pro Brutus number one. Yes, standing army should not be a thing. DH had a no, don't like it, hate it. And also the idea of a strong executive power. A lot of us really did not like that DHS officers into Portland, right? Even though it's the legality of it is still up in the air. But a lot, and it's okay. Some of us weren't. A lot of us were very pro-Brutus. Some of us were out. Brutus that had 21st century values, because he did come from a different time, and he would probably agree with a lot of the students that did not. Maybe. Yeah, no, I think he would. Yeah, for sure. And then we talked about Federalist number 10. And we talked about how we said, first of all, Mr. Diaz, why is the curriculum designed so and well, because there's a bit of a compromise that's reached, so we'll read the Constitution after. So shut it. But Federalist number 10 James Madison, who writes the Constitution, addressed the dangers, or addresses Brutus number one and says, Brutus, you have it all wrong, you idiot. is going to do more to protect against tyranny, which is basically abusive government, than more power in local governments. A bigger, fundamentally, people are self-interested in their pigs, and they are just trying to get what everybody else has, right? They're just trying to get more wealth. They're just trying to make their life. So they're going to go into different factions, and they're going to try to get whatever is going to make their life easier, better, etc. And so if you have more power in local government, then all that's going to happen is that you're going to have one faction that's able to gain power, that allies with other people, gains power, and it's just going to tyrannize another faction. And so a big republic takes that problem away. Because in a big republic, all these factions have to compete against more and more factions. And there's all this complexity and all. Also, Maxim is very much endorsing pluralist democracy, where there's all these competing interests and stuff like that. And so it does more to protect the rights of your small republics and local governments could ever do. So Brutus, you're wrong. Fundamentally, a bigger republic is better for protecting against. So these are kind of like the arguments that he presents. You don't want to destroy factions themselves because that's as tyrannies through a federal republic. Yes. We talked about this because we said if we see this in American history, all these kinds of abuses, and we said, well, because he wasn't talking about like minorities in the sense that we use today, and we said because this happened because they were fundamentally excluded from the social contract. We said, first of all, also we made a bit of a disclaimer that a lot of our historically reductive, meaning we're not going to do like the same complex interrogation of the past that you might have seen in AP US history and AP World History. Or understand key AP government concepts and then move on to talking about politics today because that's more exciting. All right, Unit 1 is kind of the history unit, the very etc. But we said this is fundamentally that about people of color being excluded from the social contract. Once they are finally included in the social contract, they receive greater protections in this larger republic because they can ally with competing different faction groups, etc. Talked about the argumentative essay, and then we come civil rights, debates about states' rights and integration and part or racial segregation in the South. And so we use this one example in keeping with the theme of talking about police. We use this one example of Ruby Bridges. So we're probably at Louisiana school. They probably would not want her, or that small local society. They probably would not want her to integrate. However, you know, in this case, the strong federal government, you know, was able to end this this majority group, Ruby Bridges, for instance. Of course, this is a very historically reductive example, but it about state rights and the power of the federal government and the relationship between the two, and whether we liked more power in the federal government or more power. It's a debate that still goes on today. So it's very much a debate that still goes on today. There's this great article I talked about how in the Washington Post that's titled something like within power in like the presidency, and I guess that seems to be true. Republicans have historically been the party of states' rights. In case study is you have a Republican president sending federal police agents into Portland, Oregon, including prediction of the spirit of states' rights. So yeah, very much a debate that still exists today. A lot of us were like really unsure whether we want more power within the federal government or state governments. I don't know. But nonetheless, I asked you to write a paper on this, or to write the outline of a paper on this, which is what I'm going to talk about next. We also talked about how Madison might view the Portland example, and we said, some of us suggested, well, if Brutus is not in favor of Portland example, we kind of were like, wait there. Could be a Madison with 21st century anti-racist values. Maybe. Also, Madison see that example and say, you idiots, you got this idea of factions completely wrong. Tons of different factions and tons of different competing groups in this democracy that I see. There's only two, you idiots. There's only Democrats and Republicans, right? And then we talked about this idea that a lot of us have been presented of there only being two sides, this like both sidesism. And we said that we talked about this novel idea as well, that people as Idaho and Mississippi or Georgia likely have the same views and same values and same priorities when they go into the voting booth, despite being from geographically different areas. And that's something Madison probably did not foresee. And that's probably likely due to stuff like mass media, like different geographically distinct areas, and giving them the same like policy preferences, values, etc. You could flip the example and go with like Democrats. Right. So there's really not a bunch of factions that are competing in our large democracy as maybe Madison envisioned, competing and making tyranny of minority groups possible, or making. And if there's only really two, you're either in power or you're not. And Republicans are in power. And so Madison might view what's happening with the DHS in faction 1 tyrannizing faction 2, possibly. I don't know. Then we talked about a thesis statement. I gave you an example of the thesis statement. One of my students incorrectly claimed, I'm just saying I'm wearing a LeBron James jersey. You've seen this in other YouTube videos. It is on 5 shirts, but it is also because LeBron James is amazing and always wins, and I love to wear my Lakers. Did amazing, incidentally, against the Portland Trail Blazers. No connection to the DHS in Portland example, but yeah, he is amazing. that Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player of all time. We said that a thesis statement has to have a claim and then a why, kind of a sense that projects what we're going to argue in the essay. And then so and then you can expect to expand upon that in one body paragraph, expand upon it in another body paragraph. Then this was your assignment. Will be on 1AS. So locate independent practice Brutus versus Madison and download. You're going to create an outline of your argumentative essay using the argumentative essay builder. The only thing that needs to be in complete sentences. So I'm going to find that really quickly. So this is what I gave you. So just type below it. So it's star 1. You're going to write your thesis statement to this prompt. Which vision of the roles and responsibilities of central government, federalist or anti-federalist, is most effective at protecting? Okay, so you're going to use one piece of evidence from one of the following documents. Brutus number 1, just to give you a hint, is an anti-federalist document, right? It has a very anti-federalist ethos. And so it would be the federalist vision of the roles and responsibilities of central government is the most effective at protecting individual rights. Right here, in evidence 1, federalist number 10. Right, and then the federalist responsibilities of whatever. That's just the claim. You need to give me the because/why. I'll leave that up to you for now. Then for evidence, you take one, you could literally copy and paste this. So if you think the Federalist vision is more important, you probably need to copy the Ruby Bridges example right there. So tell me what's in Federalist 10. Just summarize Federalist 10 if you need to. And why does it support your claim that you make? Your thesis. Why does it support the thesis statement? You can just give me bullets. If you're at a loss, then you need to review these notes. Anti-Federalist debate. Here's details about the case studies that I provided you. Everything you need to do to complete this assignment is here.